Welcome to Watchtower History.
There's some interesting cultural references that touch upon these ideas. One of them is Philip K. Dick's story, The Man in the High Castle. And a lot of his books or short stories were made into various films and series, such as Blade Runner, the Amazon series, The Man in the High Castle. In the novel of The Man to the High Castle, there's a little mention at the bottom of page 23, where it says, one had to blame the Germans for the situation, tendency to bite off more than they could chew. After all, they had barely managed to win the war, and at once they had gone off to conquer the solar system. While at home, they had passed edicts which, well, at least the idea was good, and after all, they had been successful with the Jews and Gypsies and Bible students, and the Slavs had been rolled back 2,000 years worth to their heartland in Asia, out of Europe entirely, to everyone's relief. I have an interesting book by Sinclair Lewis called It Can't Happen Here. And this was written in 1935. And it was written at the height of this propaganda, this conspiracy stuff that was going around. And Sinclair Lewis wrote this because he was watching Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini come to power. And he's also watching individuals such as Father Coughlin spouting these same type of messages. And many Americans were saying, well, that could never happen here. And so he wrote the book saying, yes, it could happen here. He won a Pulitzer Prize for that in 1935. In the 1980s, this book was modernized and turned into the miniseries V, which was basically the same story about a fascist dictatorship taking over the United States and, of course, the world. It was one of my favorite miniseries back in the day. And just to make it interesting, they redid it with reptilian space aliens.
But there were some who were skeptical, too inquisitive. They began to quickly disappear. And then...
The world was shocked today when Nobel Prize winner Dr. Maurice Jankowski of the Brussels Biomedical Institute in Belgium held a press conference to reveal the existence of an international conspiracy against the visitors.
Jankowski had unshakable proof that a conspiracy of scientists around the world was about to seize control of visitor ships for their own gain.
Hey, what the hell in New York? They pulled the plug. The whole damn network's off the air.
As the visitors tightened their control around the country, the roots of the resistance were being formed.
Look, we know what's happened. Totalitarian suppression of the truth. Not only on television, but they've got the papers too. We are under martial law.
Dr. Juliet Parrish was chosen to lead the rebels' underground movement against the visitors.
We're not the only ones who want to fight this thing. I know there are others like us all across America and all around the world.
Meanwhile, Mike Donovan had become a fugitive. And a wave of panic and fear spread across the country. A fear that turned friend against friend.
I can't work for you no more.
You've got to be more careful what you say.
What, in my own house?
He lives here.
Even members of the same family.
You don't really think you're Colvin, do you?
Could no longer trust each other.
For victory, you understand? Go tell your friends.
In the book is an interesting statement that talks about the protocols of the elders of Zion. It's an integral part of the story. The houseman who had let in the intruders and who nervously hovered at the living room door, he is the sole authority for most of the story, said that Matt Goblin, staggered, slid on a rug, and almost fell, then giggled foolishly as he sat down, waving his plug-ugly friends to the chairs and demanding, "Hey, Rabbi, how about some whiskey? A little scotch and soda? I know you Gnoim never lap up anything but snow-cooled nectar handed out by a maiden with a dulcimer, singing of Malta Bora, or maybe a little shot of Christian children's sacrificial blood." Ha ha, just a joke. And so that was the old lie about the Jews that they drank the blood of children that came out of the Middle Ages, when of course it was forbidden in Jewish law to drink blood or anything connected with blood. But that's another story for another time. Aha, just a joke, Rabbi. I know these protocols of the elders of Zion are all bunk, but awfully handy in propaganda, just the same. But I mean for plain goyim like us, a little red hooch, hear me? Dr. Schmidt started to protest. The rabbi, who had been cutting his white beard, silenced him with the wave of his fragile old hand, signaled the waiting houseman, who reluctantly brought in whiskey and siphons. Not only did the Protocols of Zion influence Henry Ford, Hitler, Father Coughlin, McCarthy, Cohn, Eustace Mullins, but as you can see, it also influenced literature. Sinclair Lewis's book mentions it. Of course, he's against it. Here's more of those Ford-Rutherford connections. So in Vindication, Rutherford says, among the powerful men who control the commerce of the sea are many Jews, so-called, yet who are against God and against Christ and against the kingdom of God. We'll go down a little bit more. The World War was really a contest for the control of the commerce of the earth. And then to skip a little bit more, to control the great commerce of the seas of the earth. Now we'll compare something that we've already seen Ford say in the earlier part of our discussion, but compare it to what Rutherford said. Compare what Ford says to what Rutherford said. Ford said, we know this. The Jews in their Congress at Basel in 1903 foresaw the future World War. How did they know it was to be a world war? We know this also. The protocols, perhaps as early as 1896, certainly not later than 1905, foresaw the policy of no annexations. The World War came to pass. And so here Ford clearly links in the protocols, and Rutherford is basically repeating what's in Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, about the Jews and the World War without saying protocols. A very, very interesting connection. Here's another one. In page 268 of Vindication, Rutherford says, the fact that many Jews are now back in Palestine does not sanctify the name of Jehovah. On the other hand, God has brought forth his people and given them a new name and made them his witnesses. We'll skip down a little bit. The gathering of the Lord's true people began after the coming of Christ Jesus to the temple. And then a little bit more, we'll skip. This prophecy could not be fulfilled upon fleshly Israel. And we've discussed this already. We had our Will the Real Jehovah's Witnesses Please Stand Up? That's all about the replacement theology that Rutherford started instituting, as well as our vindication discussion. And the whole concept in that Ezekiel context that Rutherford's looking at is about the Battle of Armageddon. And the interesting thing there is that the Jews are not restored to the land in belief. They're actually restored to the land in unbelief. And they are in unbelief until after Armageddon and the Spirit's poured out. Check our discussion on that replacement theology, as I said, because it will really make it clear when we put the scriptures and the context right on screen. The conclusion of that discussion was basically, if those are the JWs there in Ezekiel, then that means they are in unbelief until Armageddon. Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, takes this a step further. It says, when the British Army passed into Jerusalem in the memorable capture of the city in 1917, the protocols went in with it. A symbolic circle was thus closed, though not in the way the protocolists had hoped. The man who carried the protocols knew what they signified, and they were carried not in triumph, but as plans of the enemies of the world liberty. Zionism is the best advertised of all present Jewish activities and has exerted a greater influence upon world events than the average man realizes. So again, Ford's paper, William J. Cameron, his editor, they're demonizing Zionism, which is exactly the same thing that Rutherford's doing in his Vindication. In the Paranoid Apocalypse. And we've seen this page before. We talked about this earlier, but we didn't read everything. The Federal Churches of Christ condemned the anti-Semitic articles in Ford's Dearborn Independent. Ford responded, quote, arguing that the Jews are the scavengers of the world. Wherever there's anything wrong with a country, you'll find the Jews on the job there, unquote. Now, we'll read down a little bit further. Carefully and deftly skirting the issue of whether the protocols was a forgery, Ford compared the document with what was happening in the world and contended that the descriptions fit in with what's going on and that they must therefore be true. On Christmas Day in 1920, the paper declared that if the protocols are a forgery, let them, the Jews, prove it. So even Henry Ford knew that these protocols were a forgery, but he still believed in the principles behind it. And so instead of doing his own fact-checking, he asked that the Jews do it. And they did. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Stay tuned.
And again, as the dear Ford replied, let them prove it, that it's not true.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're not going to try and prove it.
No one's proving it's true.
Yeah.
They want people to prove it's not true.
So very, very interesting here. So Henry Ford and the Jews has this little statement. When Ford returned from the summer travels and refocused attention with hopes of solace upon his beloved Dearborn Independent, he discovered stagnant circulation and a hemorrhaging budget as the first year of the paper's life moved towards conclusion. This is just before the International Jews being published. Something had to be done to improve matters. Find an evil to attack, go after it and stay after it, advised Joseph Jefferson O'Neill, a veteran New York World reporter lured away from his job to try and help Ford manage his faltering public persona during the Chicago Tribune trial. Pussyfooting and being afraid to hurt people will just keep us as just where we were if we do not send it further down the ladder. If we get and print the right sort of stuff, one single series may make known to us millions. Let's have some sensationalism. The story here from the Chicago Tribune was Ford was caught for libeling somebody and got sued. He was trying to sue the Chicago paper. And so when he was brought up to court, they were asking him about some of the things he had said, and they were asking Ford some facts about the history of America. Ford really didn't even know his American history. He barely knew history at all.
In early summer 1919, Henry Ford arrived at the courthouse in Mount Clemens, Michigan, a small town north of Detroit. Ford had sued the Chicago Tribune for libel after the paper called him an ignorant idealist and an anarchist enemy of the nation. Now, he would take the stand. To disprove the allegation of libel, the Tribune set out to prove Ford's ignorance. Do you know anything about the Revolution, Mr. Ford? The Tribune's lawyer asked. Yes, sir, Ford replied. What revolution did you have in mind, Mr. Ford? In 1812, Ford answered, to the amazement of the people in the courtroom.
They basically asked him, you might say, high school questions. And he was revealed to be pathetically inarticulate and ill-informed. The stuff he didn't know was amazing to people.
Don't you know there was not any revolution in 1812? The lawyer persisted. Don't you know that this country was born out of a revolution in 1776? Did you forget that? I guess I did, Ford answered.
The defense attorneys want to paint him as someone who is semi-literate. They ask him to read passages, and he refuses. The first day he says that he forgot his glasses. The next day he said that, he can't read because his eyes are watery. And he comes across as being out of his depth.
Newspapers from across the country covered the trial in breathless detail, as Ford was subjected to 8 days of questioning.
He hates lawyers, just as he hates Wall Street. And he can't get off the stand. He can't just get up and say, I don't have to take this, I'm Henry Ford. No, sir, you are under oath.
When the trial finally concluded, the jury, made up mostly of farmers, found that Ford had indeed been libeled. He may have been ignorant, but he was no anarchist. But despite the victory, Ford was deeply wounded by the experience. The press, in particular, heaped ridicule on the automaker for his embarrassing performance.
For everyone who was there, particularly newspaper reporters, what this seemed to clinch was their suspicion that Henry Ford was a rural rube who had stumbled into his success. A stupid man representing stupid ideas and stupid people.
Mr. Ford, wrote the New York Times, has been submitted to a severe examination of his intellectual qualities. He has not received a pass. The New York Post put it even more harshly. The man is a joke.
He was not a writer. He wasn't all that literate. And the Chicago Tribune really made him look like a fool. And so it was bringing him down in the eyes of other people. And so Ford was disheartened by this. And so what to do? So let's add some sensationalism. So here, Henry Ford sits down with Williams J. Cameron to expostulate on the first appearance of Mr. Ford's own page in the Dearborn Independent. And you could see a copy of the first one there. He wanted to strike his most comfortable pose as just folks. I have never pretended to be a writer or an editor, but I can talk with Americans in a way that we can understand each other. He wanted to sound an optimistic note. This paper exists to spread ideas, the best that can be found. It desires to stir ambition and encourage independent thinking. He wanted to come across as a stern advisor. One of the chief objects of this paper will be to point out to its readers the opportunities that lie everywhere. Too many businesses have been morally ruined by this method. That is, that opportunities that lie everywhere are about them and advise how they may be used to their advantage. He wanted to lay the blame for public venality on the doorstep of the speculative capitalists who are always trying to get a hold of what another has built up. Too many businesses have been morally ruined by this method. It's not human. It does not produce anything. And he wanted to make it crystal clear that his newspaper would avoid entangling commercial alliances and not carry advertisements. The Dearborn Independent is an organ of unbiased opinion. We're making our own character. So Billy Cameron took over to do what Ford did so well. Henry Ford's spontaneous and heartfelt dicta were shaped, giving rhythm and cadence and authority, and the 16-page large-format journal set forth a bargain basement price for 5 cents a copy. Right? So now, how does he boost his sagging subscription? They're going to add some sensationalism into it. Right? And so they start this series on the International Jew, written by William Cameron. And so what they did is they were taking these protocols of Zion that Mr. Ford liked, and they were extrapolating on them and building ideas out of it. So here in the Dearborn Independent, December 25th, 1920, we can see that statement. It says, let the Jewish leaders stop the stupid shout of forgery and let them prove that the protocols have no reflection in present-day Jewish achievements. And the case is won. This is the very thing they have not attempted to do, and yet this is the very ground in which fair-minded men who never had and have not now a single anti-Jewish instinct find it impossible to throw the protocols aside as they would gladly do if only for the purpose of feeling again that the world did not possess this masterpiece of satanic wisdom. What they did is they were publishing the Protocols of Zion. And as we said before, they didn't copyright it so that it could be spread throughout the world and translated into other languages. So Henry Ford and the Jews, again, talking about this, says, this is how it got to the United States. So one of the members of the military intelligence, he was a physician in the War Department in New York. Houghton was a hardcore nativist, was a zealous counter-subversive. He was obsessed by the Jewish threat to America's war effort. And so Natalie de Bourgerie, a young woman of Russian parentage, acquired from Boris Brazil a copy of a rare edition of an arcane book by Sergei Nilis. Brazil worked closely with de Bourgerie, paid out of Houghton's personal funds on the translations of the protocols from Russian into English, the first such version in existence on American soil. Well, what happened is this found its way into Henry Ford's hands. When it got into Henry Ford's hands, they started publishing it as the International Jew in the Dearborn Independent. Houghton managed, meanwhile, to show the protocols to the Chief Justice of the United States, Charles Evan Hughes, who in turn sent it to Lewis Marshall, president of the American Jewish Committee. Other typeset copies made the rounds of the Smithsonian Institution, the Justice Department, and Military Intelligence Division headquarters in Washington. In the new year, Houghton approached Frederick O., managing editor of the New York Herald, with a very important document concerning the Jewish people and their role in world affairs. Old turned to Herman Bernstein, the paper's highly respected staff correspondent, recently returned from overseas for his opinion. When Bernstein conducted a private interview with Houghton, the good doctor went so as far to reveal to the reporter that the protocols had been prepared by Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism, that the document had been formally adopted as a cornerstone for the Zionist movement. So until this is said here, in 1920s, there was no mention of Theodor Herzl in any of the copies of the Protocols of Zion. But in the 1922 preface to the Protocols of Zion, now there's a story about Theodor Herzl having originated this plot. So as we said earlier, this story keeps getting modified and changed all the time. Or Henry Ford said it was the Jews and communists. But when the Nazis reprinted it, they said it was the Jews, the communists, and the Freemasons. And in some cases, and some documents, the Jews, the communists, the Masons, and the Bible students / Jehovah's Witnesses. They had modified it. So it's one of those things that you can just keep modifying, and whoever's your enemy, you can just throw them into the mix. So in this preface, it says, the presumption is strong that the protocols were issued or reissued at the First Zionist Congress held in Basel in 1897 under the presidency of the father of modern Zionism, the late Theodor Herzl. Nothing like picking on a dead guy, right? There has been recently published a volume of Herzl's diaries, a translation of some of the passages of which appeared in the Jewish Chronicle of July 14th, 1922. Herzl gives an account of his first visit to England in 1895 and his conversation with Colonel Goldsmith, a Jew brought up as a Christian, an officer in the English army, and at heart a Jew nationalist all the time. Goldsmith suggested to Herzl the best way of expropriating the English aristocracy and so destroying their power to protect the people of England against Jew domination was to put excessive taxes on the land. Herzl thought this was an excellent idea, and it is now to be found definitively embodied in Protocol 6. So the above extract from Herzl's diary is extremely significant. So I got to thinking. We're told where to look. We're told where to look in the newspaper. We're told where to look in the diaries. Let's try and fact check this, like we do with everything in Watchtower history, and see if it matches what's claimed. That would have been very difficult at the time in 1922 when this was written.
And it would have been difficult 10 years ago.
Yeah. Or 10, 15 years ago, because a lot of these newspapers and books and articles were not available. You would have had to go to multiple libraries around the world to find them. Now with a simple newspapers.com account or a subscription to things like that, or archive.org or Google Books or other companies scanning all these old public domain books of the world and newspapers and magazines, now we can actually look these things up and try and fact check it and see what we can find. So are these accusations against Theodor Herzl, can we go to the original source that they're saying that it was in and see if it matches? So the Detroit Jewish Chronicle, Friday, July 14th, 1922. And it says, and there's some quotes from the diary. It says, at the same time, he was an advocate of auto-emancipation. In his first Congress address, delivered at Basel on August 29th, 1897, talking about Herzl, he declared that a people can be helped by its own efforts. And if it cannot help itself, it is beyond succor. But we Zionists want to rouse the people to self-help. His faith in the ultimate survival of the Jewish nation and its rehabilitation on its ancient soil, he summed up by declaring that the whole branches of Judaism may wither and fall, but the trunk remains. In his deep sense of honor and self-respect as a Jew, he embodied in the statement that an agreement between the Jewish people and the world powers must be based on rights, not on toleration. Truly, we have had enough experience of toleration and of protection, which could be revoked at any time. Upon rereading of Herzl's Judenstaat, we learn of the truth of the Talmudic saw that the ways of the world are alike. What was true in Herzl's time is true today and is true tomorrow, for history has been accursed to repeat itself. To quote from the introduction to Herzl's book, it says, the Jewish question exists wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers. Where it does not exist, it's carried by Jews in the course of their migrations. We naturally move to those places where we are not persecuted, and there our presence produces persecution. The unfortunate Jews are now carrying anti-Semitism into England, and they have already introduced it into America. So is there anything like that in this newspaper that the preface to the protocols is suggesting that Herzl said? There's nothing there that I can see. Okay, the preface also suggests to look at Herzl's diaries about a Colonel Goldsmith. Well, thankfully, Theodor Herzl's diaries are available, and there's several volumes of them, actually. So here is Herzl's opinion of Goldsmith, and this is July 10th. And he doesn't talk about Goldsmith often in the diaries, and since it's, a PDF file and you can actually search it, it's very easy to find. He starts out liking Goldsmith like a brother, but in the end, he basically sends Goldsmith will no longer be counted upon. Not because he didn't like him, but his occupation would keep him out of it. The plans that Herzl discussed with Goldsmith are discussed here. And he says, quote, you don't know what it's all about. Let me explain it to you first. A colony is a little state. A state is a big colony. You want to build a small state, a big colony. He has no faith in the promises of the Turks. Even if he did believe in them, he would still not engage in such an undertaking. He thinks it would be impossible to keep the influx of the masses into Palestine under control. So all he's talking about is creating a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. So again,
again, to emphasize, and not to take over the world, the banking system, Hollywood, attack it's just that was all the whole thing. It was to put a homeland back, just like the Bible says, going back to the homeland.
Yeah, and so it's again the claim that's here, and they tell you where to look, and when you go look, it doesn't match the claim. very, very strange. But I guess when it was written at that time, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to verify. How else could we know what was said? It was also said, the third instance is, well, it was at the First Zionist Congress. Well, we have a report from the First Zionist Congress written at the time, the London Times, September 4th, 1897. There's nothing at all in this about anything remotely similar to the protocols.
Now there is one thing to notice about that Congress, the Zionist Congress. Like most Christians they define themselves as Ezekiel's dry bones coming to life. Okay. Other Christians feel the same way. Again, Rutherford, who was believing all this conspiracy stuff, believing in the protocols of Zion, what Ford was teaching and all that, all of a sudden, no, the bones aren't to the Jewish people. Let's reinterpret that scripture. And it became them becoming awakened again after a bout of spiritual darkness. And again, we have dates with that. It's just so every scripture applied to themselves. And as you go through a lot of these old stuff, like we have been, and mostly Jeff gets 90% of the credit for all the research in this.
There's other help. There's other people who are helping as well.
And there's other help. Yes, we had a couple other people help. As you go through this, you see how far removed Rutherford became from not only religion, the Bible, but actual history that happened. So that I find it quite comical to see this in the Zionist Congress. So you were going to go on to the next point.
Yeah, we have also the written program for what they were supposed to outline and what they were going to talk about. There's nothing on the program about it either. As stated, the claims made about Theodore Herzl and this Congress don't match what we know historically.
By the mid-19th century, the idea of a worldwide Jewish conspiracy is well established. In 1868, Hermann Goethe writes Biarritz, an anti-Semitic novel under the more respectable pen name of Sir John Redcliffe. Biarritz is especially significant because of one scene in which Jewish leaders conduct a secret meeting in a Prague cemetery. 30 years later, that same exact setting appears in a new document, the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. But this time, it's not said to be fiction. It's purported to be true.
The protocols had a particular impact because they were alleged to be a first-hand document. There was not a report about something, it was the actual something itself. And because it was understood to be this first-hand report, it had far more of an impact than would otherwise have been the case.
The protocols look like and contain the same kind of language found in real meeting minutes at the turn of the century. They outline in a seemingly businesslike manner the 24 steps to Jewish world domination. Even document experts who analyze the protocols when they first come out are fooled into believing the manuscript is real.
We shall soon begin to establish huge monopolies, reservoirs of colossal riches upon which even the large fortunes of non-Jews will depend to such an extent that they will go down on the day after the political revolution.
It was phenomenal. It turned people's heads. There's report after report of people saying, I didn't know that this sort of thing was taking place. It was very powerful.
In addition to its authentic look, the Protocols also pretends to name names, and some of the names in the document are those of real Jewish leaders. Theodore Herzl is listed as the chief sage of the Elders of Zion. This was a particularly clever deception because the same year that the protocols were released, the real Theodor Herzl was in Basel, Switzerland, leading the First World Jewish Congress.
Zionism, the longing to return to the land of Israel, had been on the lips of Jews ever since the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem and the exile of the Jews from their homeland by the Romans in 70 CE. Over 1800 years later, in Vienna, journalist Theodor Herzl, an assimilated Jew, unleashed his Zionist dream of a Jewish settlement in the land of Israel.
What Herzl was looking for was Zionism, as he saw it, to solve the problem of the Jews. Anti-Semitism.
Appalled at the false accusations of treason leveled against the only Jewish officer in the French General Staff, Alfred Dreyfus, Herzl was motivated to find a solution. He considered several options.
Herzl is searching for answers. Just to give you an idea how removed he was from things Jewish, he writes in his diaries, let's look for some solution that'll satisfy us all. Perhaps mass conversion. A major pageant. The Jews, the prominent Jews, will march up to the major cathedral in Vienna and baptize. No Jews, no anti-Semitism. He quickly dismissed that.
Ultimately, Herzl focused his efforts on creating a homeland for the Jews and started a chain of events that continues to this day.
Zionism says we want to be like other peoples. There's a naivete to it, of course, that once we have our normal state, we can live, quote, normal lives, then anti-Semitism disappears.
Herzl tirelessly navigated the political wills and interests of the Jewish leaders, secular and religious, which opposed him. He traveled the world in an effort to enlist the agreement of the great powers in achieving his Zionist goal. In London, concerned with the large wave of Jewish immigration to England, a royal commission of the British Parliament assured him that England would favour a Jewish colony, not in the Holy Land, but in East African Uganda. When the 6th Zionist Congress convened in Basel in August 1903, the Uganda proposal, supported by Herzl, was the dominant issue. It provoked a firestorm of protest, led mainly by the Eastern European Zionist leaders, Chaim Weizmann and Menachem Yushchiskin. By 1904, it was apparent that Zionism stood for the Jewish people's return to the land of Israel and no place else.
In 1893, a Viennese journalist wrote, "When I think of my son's future, I ask myself whether I have the right to make life so difficult for him as it has become for me. That is why we must baptize Jewish children, while they can still feel nothing, either for it or against it. We Jews must submerge in the people."
In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti.
It's not something you'd expect to hear from the man known as the father of Zionism. But those words were written by Theodor Herzl, who spent his life trying to solve what he called the Jewish question. Herzl was born in Budapest in 1860. At the time, the city was known as Judapest because of its large Jewish population. As a boy, he attended a Christian high school that was open to Jews. And on his 13th birthday, his parents held a confirmation ceremony instead of a bar mitzvah.
Theodor Herzl was an assimilated Jew who came from an assimilated family. He was not educated in the Jewish sphere at all. He was very, very far from Judaism.
His family later moved to Vienna, where Herzl earned a law degree. But his real passion was writing, so he divided his time between writing plays, working as a reporter, and looking for a way to end anti-Semitism.
Theodor Herzl is the one who sort of pulls it together, but there are many. There are Christian ministers, there are rabbis, there are presidents, there are all kinds of people who are saying, wait a minute, we've got this problem.
At one point, Herzl even proposed a mass baptism of Jewish babies in Vienna's largest cathedral. He believed that if Jews adopted Christian culture, they would finally be accepted by European society. But Theodor Herzl was about to get an assignment that would change his mind.
It was as a journalist for the top newspaper in Vienna that he was sent to Paris to write about the wonderful French experience. Herzl, who was a bon vivant, you know, and was living in Paris and enjoying himself and going to the theater 3 times a week, and all of a sudden, he saw the ugly face of anti-Semitism.
Herzl was assigned to cover the famous Dreyfus affair, in which a French Jewish captain was falsely convicted of spying for the Germans. Herzl watched as Alfred Dreyfus was stripped of his medals and publicly degraded at the military school in Paris. Crowds filled the streets, shouting death to the Jews.
People are inflamed, and they're shouting, not down with Dreyfus, not down with the individual, they shout down with the Jews. And Theodor Herzl has his aha moment.
Herzl realized that the only solution to anti-Semitism was for the Jews to have their own state.
Wonderful idea. How do you go about doing it? This is where the writer of plays came in, you know. He was going to set the stage.
Herzl shut himself in his apartment and wrote his ideas down for 5 straight days. When a friend of his visited, he was alarmed by Herzl's disheveled appearance and wild ideas. He suggested they get some fresh air. And as they walked, he told Herzl to get some medical help before someone hauled him off to a madhouse. Herzl paid no attention, and the following year, he published his most famous work, The Jewish State.
Theodor Herzl, in his book, The Jewish State, dreams. And he talks about this new nation state being a beacon to humanity. He talks about it being a model democracy.
Not everyone was thrilled with Herzl's ideas. Religious Jews thought it was blasphemy to reestablish the nation of Israel without the Messiah. Nevertheless, Herzl worked tirelessly to realize his vision. He even tried to buy the land of Palestine.
He tried to create a situation where he will be introduced to the Sultan of Turkey, and he will buy the land of Israel from him. Boy, that's going to cost a lot of money. How is he going to pay for it? Well, he had the dream. He had an idea. He says, I'm going to take half of the riches of all the rich Jews. Well, of course, there was absolutely no chance that any of these people would do that. They did not want to see Zionism succeed, in fact. But he was convinced that that's the way to do it.
In 1897, Herzl gathered Jewish delegates from around the world for the first World Zionist Congress. For this historic meeting, he chose the city of Basel in Switzerland.
By the way, do you know why it was in Basel? It was supposed to be in Munich. And in Munich, there were Jews who called themselves Germans of the faith of Moses. And they said to him, we don't want this Jewish riffraff from all over the world coming to Munich.
In August, more than 200 delegates from 17 countries arrived in Basel. It was the first representative Jewish assembly in nearly 2,000 years, and the atmosphere was electric. Behind the podium hung a white flag with 2 blue stripes and a Star of David, a version of the design that would be adopted by the State of Israel 50 years later. Among the delegates was a man Herzl introduced as the first Christian Zionist. The Reverend William Heckler was the British Embassy chaplain in Vienna. He was deeply interested in the return of the Jews to Israel. So he helped Herzl make some important political connections, and the two became lifelong friends. As Herzl walked to the podium, people cheered and stomped their feet. He opened the Congress by announcing, "We are here to lay the foundation stone of the house which is to shelter the Jewish nation." The applause was deafening. One English delegate described the excitement of the crowd. "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept as we remembered Zion. By the rivers of Basel, we sat down and resolved to weep no more."
The beautiful thing about Theodor Herzl and the beautiful thing about Zionism is that it doesn't just stop with the negative. There is anti-Semitism, and there is negativity, and there's a certain rejection on the part of Europe. But what they also do is, I call it the jujitsu move, where you take the negative and you turn it into something positive.
A few days later, Herzl made a bold statement in his diary.
"At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, and certainly in 50, everyone will know it."
Herzl's statement turned out to be prophetic. 50 years later, the United Nations approved a plan to divide Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. And 9 months later, the State of Israel was born. After the Congress, Herzl, who had never been religious, started observing some Jewish traditions. That winter, instead of having a Christmas tree, the Herzl family celebrated their first Hanukkah.
During the spring, Herzl convened a conference of his deputies in Vienna to organize the Zionist Congress he wanted to hold that August. Among other things, it was decided to hold the conference in Munich, a central location with plenty of kosher restaurants and hotels. But as soon as the word got out about the Congress, trouble began developing. Vienna Chief Rabbi Moritz Gudemann, who a year and a half earlier had likened Herzl to Moses, wrote an attack against Zionism, insisting that Judaism and nationalism were not compatible. In Berlin, the Rabbinical Council of Germany also published a strong statement against the Zionist movement and the plans for a Congress. This led to protests from Munich's Jewish leadership about holding the Zionist Congress in their city. An angry Herzl decided to move the convocation to Basel, Switzerland, where he had more support from the local Jewish community. Herzl arrived at Basel's hotel Les Trois Rois, overlooking the Rhine, a few days before the Congress was to begin. He quickly rented the Stadtcasino, a well-known concert hall in the small Swiss city, for the assembly. And then the delegates, more than 200 of them from 17 countries, started to arrive. They had come to the Congress seeking a life beyond pogroms and religious persecution. They could hardly contain their excitement over what they believed was about to happen for the Jewish people. They were sure that they were transforming the dream of returning the Jewish people to the land of Israel into a reality.
This was the first gathering on such a scale that had taken place for almost 2,000 years. Delegates coming from all over the world, different Jewish communities, meeting in Basel to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine, recognized in international law.
The delegates hailed from all over Europe, North Africa, Palestine, and America. There were lawyers from Vienna, bankers from Holland and Sweden, along with professors and students from Germany, as well as shopkeepers from Poland and Hungary. Some were rich and others poor. Many were young men from Eastern Europe and Russia, carrying satchels of food with them from home prepared by their wives and mothers for the long journey, primarily by third-class rail. The religious mingled with the secular. One group that stayed away was the Jewish aristocracy. And so did the Neue Freie Presse, While more than 30 members of the world press covered the Congress, Herzl's editors, who were angrily opposed to his Zionist activities, chose not to send a reporter and never mentioned one word about the conference in the paper. Julie Herzl was also a no-show. She and her husband had argued for weeks because she refused to attend. She disapproved of her husband's Zionist activities even more than his employers did. What had happened to the prominent journalist she had married, she demanded, the well-known man about town, who was now leading an ethnic cause she had no interest in whatsoever. Herzl's experience in the theater gave him a sense of how to choreograph the event. He personally supervised the lighting, the stage setting, and even how the delegates would dress. That evening, as he walked to the podium to deliver his inaugural address, Theodor Herzl was greeted with the stomping of feet and a thunderous ovation. People reached out to kiss his hand as he walked by. On the stage, as he tried to begin his speech, the cheers of the crowd would not end. One delegate, the Hebrew writer Ben Ami, recorded how among the cheers one could hear the cries of Yehi HaMelech, long live the king. When he finally got the opportunity to speak, Herzl went straight to the point. He explained that they needed to set up an organization to negotiate with the great powers, and specifically with the Ottoman Empire, to achieve Jewish settlement in Palestine on a large scale. Jewish colonization should no longer be conducted in secret and must be in accord with international law. Herzl concluded that the goal of the Zionist Congress was to create a new kind of Jew.
A people can only help itself. If it cannot, that people cannot be helped at all. We want to lay the cornerstone of the edifice that is one day to house the Jewish nation. We have come home, as it were. Zionism is our return to Judaism even before our return to the Jewish land.
When Herzl finished his speech, pandemonium once again broke out. The crowd rushed to the stage, knocking over chairs and tables. A woman in the gallery fainted. As Herzl rested in his hotel room for the first time in days, he took a moment to write in his diary.
The man who brought to Basel the daydreams he had had in the Tuileries Gardens 2 years before, that man may yet sail the Mediterranean Sea as a Jew returning home.
On the Sabbath, a day before the first Zionist Congress opened, Theodor Herzl and Max Nordau, who could count on less than one hand the number of times they had been to synagogue as adults, decided to attend services out of respect to the religious delegates who were coming and the Jewish community of Basel. When the Zionist leader was called up to the Torah to say the blessings, there was a hush as he recited them perfectly, without pause. Herzl's trip to the synagogue was also evidence of a growing relationship with Basel's Rabbi Arthur Cohen, who also served as chief rabbi of Switzerland. At the closing session of the Congress, one of the most emotional moments occurred when Rabbi Cohen came to the podium and recalled how several weeks earlier he, like most of Europe's rabbis, spoke out against Zionism. But now, he explained, that after listening to the speeches of the past few days and meeting with Herzl, he had a change of heart. He was now a supporter of the movement. The rabbi expressed that he had only one concern about the new Jewish state. Would the Sabbath and other doctrines of the faith be kept? Herzl rose from his chair and answered him.
Judaism has nothing to fear from the Jewish state.
Rabbi Cohen responded that he would now dedicate his life to the Zionist cause.
I will place you in your own land is God's promise to them. They are to have a national...
In his sermon, Spurgeon went on to expound the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel chapter 37. In less than 100 years, Ezekiel's prophecy, along with those of many other Old Testament prophets, would come to pass, and the state of Israel would be reborn in her own land, rising from the ashes of the Holocaust. Another prominent evangelical of the day preaching on the restoration of Israel was Henry Grattan Guinness.
Henry Grattan was well known as an evangelist to huge crowds, and a very clearly remarkable preacher during some of the revivals in the UK and also in the USA and in France. So he was travelling all over the place.
They called him, the newspapers called him a rival to Spurgeon, didn't they? I mean, if there was such a thing as rivalry, actually they were great friends.
Yeah. And Henry Grattan eventually felt the call to the mission field, but met Hudson Taylor in Ireland, who said to him, "I'd rather that you trained our missionaries who are going to go out there." So Henry Grattan set up a college in London called Harley House in the East End of London, in Bow, in a rough area, and began effectively a faith mission for training about 50 or more missionaries per annum to go out to all parts of the world in the sort of new missionary ventures. And from that, he's beginning to do work that others have also done in seeing that God wants to restore the Jews to Israel. But currently, in his day, the Turkish Ottoman Empire is ruling there and oppressing Jews. So this is a longing that he sees in Scripture, he sees it prophesied, and he's beginning to think wider thoughts about that, as well as mission issues. So those two are going together. It's a great longing for God's missionary work to be done.
Now, Grattan Guinness also, some of the links that he had were very far-reaching, particularly with the Earl of Shaftesbury. At their college, there was a fountain in the back garden. I mean, the East End was rough and it was depressed and the people were hungry and it was very run down. But they were one of the few places that had a little garden that was like an oasis with a pear tree. And people like Shaftesbury used to come and escape and sit in this garden and talk to Fanny, particularly Grattan Guinness's first wife, who was passionate about the fact that the Jews must be restored. So passionate that they were buying land in Israel whenever they could, because they believed at some point they would be able to give it back to the Jewish people at the right time. Not only that, she was saying to all their friends, William and Catherine Booth of the Salvation Army, regular friends who were there. Moody, when he came to this country, used to, Harley College was a base for him. And they all were in a network.
Indeed, a vision for Israel's restoration was very prevalent in Britain.
Throughout the 19th century, British society was philo-Semitic. Ironically, despite pockets of anti-Semitism, there was this expectation amongst the British population that the Jews would one day return to Palestine. And this, I think, was thanks in part due to the influence of the Puritans and the influence of the evangelicals, which was quite widespread. And you see it in the poetry of Lord Byron, who was certainly no evangelical, or in the novels of George Eliot, who again was no evangelical. Philo-Semitism was in the air, it was in the water of Victorian Britain.
The restorationist vision spread across the Atlantic in part due to John Nelson Darby, who had founded the Plymouth Brethren back in the 1830s. He toured America extensively over a number of years.
During the course of 7 tours of the United States, John Nelson Darby would meet men such as D.L. Moody, one of the most famous evangelists ever to cross the Atlantic and proclaim the gospel in these lands. Moody would land for the first time in 1872 and is well known for his evangelistic crusades with Ira Sankey. D.L. Moody was directly influenced in his theology and his eschatology by John Nelson Darby. Darby's belief in the restoration of Israel and the return of the Lord fired that entire movement, which gave rise to men like D.L. Moody, William E. Blackstone, Cyrus Schofield, and so on and so forth.
These men, in turn, would leave a legacy that would have a profound impact on the events of 1917.
1891 is a critical year. This is 10 years after the outbreak of pogroms in Russia against the Jewish people, when whole communities were butchered. Many Christians like William E. Blackstone can't sit back and let this happen. They can't just pray. They've got to do something. And so in 1891, William Blackstone draws up a petition containing 400 signatures, which he presents to President Harrison and Secretary of State James Blaine. This petition calls on the American president to use his influence on the monarchs, the czars, the princes, the prime ministers of Europe to convene a conference to discuss the plight of the Jewish people. Although nothing actually came of the petition in 1891, it was represented several years later in 1917, the year of the Balfour Declaration, to the then US President Woodrow Wilson, a Bible-believing Christian who also believed in the restoration of the Jews to the land, as it was known then of Palestine.
Back in England, Henry Grattan Guinness was writing books on eschatology.
In 1886 was one of the main books which became very, very popular that Henry Grattan published. He was talking about the closing of the times of the Gentiles. And he mentions in there that one of the dates he foresaw, and he wasn't predicting what would happen. This is important. He's not a futurologist trying to be sensational. He's just saying, as Jerusalem was destroyed bit by bit in the Babylonian era, first Nebuchadnezzar coming along, so there'll be a gradual return in a reverse process. And he saw dates there mentioned in Daniel, measured not just in our usual calendar years, but lunar years, so it's a bit more complex, of which one significant date he saw and published in 1886 would be 1917. Now, he didn't predict what would happen, but he said it might be a momentous date for the return of the Jews to the land. Now, of course, with hindsight, we know some significance about that. But these were well known and much talked about. He also had in his Bible, which I've got here, which he wrote copious notes and calculations in his margins of the book of Daniel, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. He shared with his family that he saw 1948 as another date that he saw highly significant in the return of the Jews to the land.
Meanwhile, on continental Europe in the mid-1890s, Jewish nationalist hopes came to the fore as a result of a resurgence of anti-Semitism following the Dreyfus affair.
In the late 1880s, 1890s, there is a young man living in Vienna by the name of Theodor Herzl. He is an acculturated Jewish journalist. He has a Christmas tree. He doesn't circumcise his son. Being a journalist, he looks around. He starts to become increasingly worried about anti-Semitism in Central and Eastern Europe. And finally, he concludes in 1895 that the Jews have no choice but to leave. They must evacuate Europe as soon as possible.
Residing in Vienna at the same time was a Church of England minister by the name of William Heschler.
William Heschler, who was half German, half British, was a devout restorationist. All his life, he had looked for the return of the Jewish people to Palestine. By God's grace, he was appointed a few years earlier to be the British chaplain at the embassy in Vienna. In 1896, William Heschler is walking through the streets of Vienna, and there he saw a copy of Herzl's book in a shop window, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. And soon afterwards, he met Theodor Herzl. And Theodor Herzl explained his vision to the Reverend Heschler. And the chaplain of the British embassy became very excited, and he says, I know key influential people all over Europe. I can help you, and I can especially get you an audience with the German Kaiser. And from that moment on, from March 1896 until 1904, when Theodor Herzl died, William Heschler was at his side, advising, helping, engaging in diplomatic missions for Theodor Herzl and the Zionist movement. You might say that William Heschler was the foreign minister of Zionism, especially in those early years.
The hopes of the Jewish nationalists now lay with Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II was now the one who was seen as the Cyrus who would restore Israel in her ancient homeland. Heschler arranged for Herzl to meet with the German Kaiser when they visited the Promised Land in 1898. The first meeting took place at Mikveh, Israel, as the Kaiser journeyed from Jaffa to Jerusalem.
Behind me is the place where the two men met initially on October 28, 1898, and then again several days later in Jerusalem. And the outcome was negative. The Kaiser's rebuff of Herzl's proposal was to be expected. Germany was trying to forge a geopolitical alliance with Turkey, and fostering a Jewish homeland in Palestine ran counter to Turkish ideology. Now, for the first time, the Jewish nationalists themselves began looking to Britain to be their Cyrus. But unlike the situation in 1840, this time it was the initiative of the Jewish people themselves.
Jewish nationalist hopes now lay with Britain taking control of their promised land. Although that looked unlikely at the turn of the 20th century, a number of leading politicians came from an evangelical background and were sympathetic to the restorationist vision.
With some of the evidence that we've already shown, now we'll look at the book Warrant for Genocide, The Myth of the Jewish World Conspiracy and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion by Norman Cohn. And it's talking about this Zionist conference and some of the various claims that have been made about it over the years. And they keep changing, of course. One of them is that it came from a French source. Cohn in his book says, there could hardly have been a worse choice. The original manuscript of the protocols was in French. But at the first Zionist Congress, there was not a single French delegate, and the official language was German. Herzl, the founder of the modern Zionism, was an Austrian, and the entire proceedings of the Congress were held in public. While the town of Basel overflowed with journalists who would hardly have overlooked so extraordinary a meeting, but in any case, Nilus himself, in his edition of 1905, had categorically stated that the lectures were delivered not in 1897, but in 1902 and 1903. So he gets the date wrong, gets the language wrong, gets several things wrong in this. Cohn continues, as though the confusion was not already sufficient, the editors of the various later translations of the protocols invented still further stories. The editor of the first German edition in 1919, who passed under the name of Gottfried Zerbeck, maintains that the elders of Zion were simply the members of the Basel Congress. He explains, too, just how their machinations were unmasked. According to him, the Russian government, always anxious about Jewish activities, sent a spy to observe the Congress. A Jew who was entrusted with taking the minutes of the non-existent secret meetings from Basel to the Jewish Masonic Lodge at Frankfurt am Main was bribed by this spy to lend them for a night at an unnamed town on the way. Fortunately, the spy had with him a whole squad of copyists. Writing frantically, these men managed during that night to copy many of the minutes, which were then sent to Nilus for translation into Russian.
Now, hang on. Gonna interrupt you here. I gotta insert a comment. Doesn't this sound just like how Watchtower describes things, how they happen?
Yeah.
That literally sounds how Watchtower will relay their history. And fortunately, the spy had a whole squad of, and the day was saved, and that's I can't help but notice that. It's just too funny.
And so, as we saw in the newspaper article that we quoted, that was written at the time, all these stories that come up after about this Congress keep changing, just like the protocols themselves keep changing. The Nazis had changed it from just a Jewish world conspiracy to a Jewish Bible student Jehovah's Witness conspiracy to a Jewish Bible student Jehovah's Witness Masonic conspiracy. William Heschler, an Anglican Christian Zionist, was also at that first Zionist conference, and the way he reports it is exactly the same way that the newspaper reported it at the time that it happened. But there's more. In the paranoid apocalypse, this continues. The protocols keep evolving and changing as time goes on. So the paranoid apocalypse states, by the 1960s, the protocols was regularly being used to buttress the argument that Jews were behind the threat posed to the United States by international communism. The situation was apparently serious enough that in 1963, the Subcommittee on Internal Security of the Senate Committee on the Judiciary decided to investigate the matter. Even J. Edgar Hoover complained about the time his agency had to devote to dealing with these kind of charges. Hoover traced the notion that there was a link between communism and Judaism, and also between communists and Jews, to the Soviet Union itself. According to Hoover, this was one of the ways in which the Soviet Union aimed to create a division and strife in the United States. Richard Helms, then assistant of the CIA, testified before the subcommittee and charged that the contemporary communists were skillful in the production and exploitation of this forgery. The Senate report pointedly called attention to the ubiquitous nature of the protocols by noting that a similar version of this document was being widely distributed in the Soviet Union, but in contrast to the American edition, this one equated international Jewry with international capitalism. One must marvel at the creativity of the anti-Semite. And so, again, examples of how this has changed through every single various edition that it goes through. But there's more. Here's that 1964 subcommittee. It states, it is impossible for a fair-minded person of any common sense not to see that the protocols are the fictional product of a warped mind, and that for years they have been and still are the chief staple of the anti-Jewish pamphleteer. In the subcommittee's judgment, those who would mislead the American people by continuing to peddle this crude and vicious nonsense impede and prejudice the nation's fight against the communist menace. The subcommittee believes that the peddlers of the protocols are peddlers of un-American prejudice who spread hate and dissension among the American people. Falsely using the guise of fighting communism, they, like the communists who set class against class, would set religion against religion. Both would subvert the American system. And then there's the Russians. Remember, this story here that's in the preface here is that this originated from a secret council by the Jews. And then it leaked out by a whole group of copyists that this guy just happened to have with him. There's a similar story to that by a Hermann Ottomar Friedrich Goetsch, and his pseudonym was Sir John Ratcliffe. He was a German writer and an anti-Semitist. So like, a lot of the other anti-Semitic works, the Jews are blamed for everything. So in his novel, he talks about a secret meeting that Jewish leaders conduct where something like the protocols come out. And they're plotting for worldwide takeover. Except this meeting is not at the Theodor Herzl one. This one was in a Prague cemetery 30 years earlier. So the same story is picked up, plagiarized, and repurposed to spread lies about the meaning of Theodor Herzl. But, these guys aren't real creative when they put out these forgeries. They almost pretty much copy them verbatim a lot of times. And we'll get into that a little bit here in the future as well. Here's an example of some of the anti-Semitism in American artwork, the history of the United States. You can see here Uncle Sam pushing the Indian off the cliff. Then Uncle Sam standing there all smug when the Jewish man comes and pushes him off the cliff. Back to the paranoid apocalypse. Hitler's reaction in the recounting of Hermann Röchling embodies every aspect of this analysis. Quote, "He must beat the Jew with his own weapon. I saw that the moment I read the book. Down to the veriest detail, I found the protocols immensely instructive on such topics as political intrigue, the technique of conspiracy, revolutionary subversion, prevarication, deception, and organization. As he plotted his own war of conquest to enslave the world's races, he projected precisely that intention on the Jews. In reading the protocols, one has the feeling one is reading the descriptions of Hitler's own plans. Page after page, all one needs to do is substitute the words Hitler will whenever the protocols say the Jews." Hitler did not have the protocols in his library. When he died, and they looked at Hitler's library, there were no copies of the protocol in it. But there were several copies of Ford's International Jew. That was the book that was required reading. That was the book they had in 1922 when you would visit the Nazi office.
So apparently he held that close to his heart.
You would have saw a framed photo of Henry Ford on his wall and copies of his book, The International Jew, all over the table. And here you can see a Photoshop I did of what this might have looked like. The Chicago Daily Tribune for Thursday, March 8th, 1923, has an article, "Berlin hears Ford is backing Hitler." And there's a little paragraph in there that says, "The wall beside his desk in Hitler's private office is decorated with a large picture of Henry Ford. In the antechamber, there's a large table covered with books, nearly all of which are a translation of a book written and published by Henry Ford." If you ask one of Hitler's underlings for the reason of Ford's popularity in these circles, he will smile knowingly, but say nothing. The New York Times for Wednesday, December 20th, 1922, has an article, "Heinrich Ford, Idol of Bavaria, Fascist Chief." And there's a little paragraph in there with a subheading of The International Jew. It says, "The articles which Herr Hitler referred to evidently were from the Dearborn Independent. They have been published in 2 volumes by Hammer Verlag of Leipzig and are displayed in every bookshop in southern Germany. The title is The International Jew, with Henry Ford's name on the front page as the author." And then there's a quote here. "It is not true that Mr. Ford is backing the fascist movement in Germany financially," said Herr Hitler, "but Heinrich's picture occupies the place in honor of Herr Hitler's sanctorum." We can see here that, of course, Ford and Hitler would agree on the protocols. And we're starting to see Rutherford also agrees with these things as well.